Sugar and Spikes is a science-backed and semi-sarcastic mental health podcast for a new type of business leader. Mental health concerns are occasionally addressed, but this podcast is not intended to diagnose or treat any condition, mental, physical, metaphysical, or otherwise. That's a job for your doctor or therapist, not a podcast. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's get on with the show.
Back with another episode of the Sugar and Spikes podcast, a science-backed and semi-sarcastic thoughtcast for a new type of business leader.
Oh, we're starting it that way now?
That was how I always envisioned it to be started, with Dean's new intro.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We finally got it there.
I'm Des. I'm a co-host that currently forgot the rest of the tagline.
But you had that super cool, title.
Exactly, and I can't remember it.
I liked it.
So that's how today's going to be.
Well, I'm Tammy. I am a licensed psychologist, and I really have nowhere to go from there.
There you go.
All I say, and then I stop.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just. What was it? It was an adjective. It was something content creator.
I know. It was so good, though.
Not constant.
Agile.
It was what's that word for almost compulsive? Serial.
Serial.
Was it?
Oh yeah. You're a serial content creator.
Okay. All right. Let's redo this.
It's a way more sexy sounding title than mine.
Because I get to make it up. Okay.
No,
so
don't start over.
Okay.
No.
That's not what we do.
You never let me do that.
Yeah,
I'm
do
always
that here.
Let's take it out. And you always leave it in.
Well,
so welcome
because I don't do my editing.
So now it's going to happen to you.
Okay. We also had another really good way to
oh my God,
kick off the show.
We just cannot even get it together. Okay.
Today, this bright, glorious Friday morning.
Beautiful day.
I don't know why I said Friday morning. It's Friday afternoon, and I hate when podcasts are on this day, blah, blah. I'm I'm not listening to it
on that day, so it's totally irrelevant.
Also, yeah, sure, you're in Palm Springs. I'm not in Palm Springs. It's -20 out. Anyways, right now, as we record in this very moment, it's gorgeous.
Oh, it's beautiful out. Yeah.
And of course, of all days, we picked today to talk about pragmatism.
Of course.
Perfect. I feel like I think I've been challenging myself on that recently. Again,
saying think instead of feel.
When it's appropriate.
Sure. When it's a thought, not a feeling.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I think that really ties into what the podcast is rooted into, pragmatism versus, I don't know, what's the antithesis of pragmatic?
Well, I don't think of a word, but I think of follow your passion, do your dream.
I think of glitter unicorns.
Yeah, me too.
So we're the antithesis of glitter unicorns.
So sparkle.
So we're what, dull and faded?
Oh, that sounds
horses.
So sad. Everybody's going to be like, I don't want to hear about that, and they're going to turn it off.
You know what? There's glitter unicorns, and then there's strong black steeds, they're really kick-ass night horses.
Mm-hmm.
That's
the ring wraiths.
Yeah, we're those. And today we're going to talk about that even more, because sometimes you got to bust into work on your as a goddamn ring wraith when you're just done.
It's true.
Yeah.
Emotionally and businessy, right? So obviously when we start to talk about these topics, I'm like, oh, emotion, and then you're like business, and then how are we going to make those mesh? And this is how we're going to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes with emotions you got to be practical.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes in business you have to too.
And the flip side on both, right? Sometimes in business you do have to let emotion come into play. We talk a lot about being relational,
Yeah, so I think I know, at least for me, that when I hear the word emotional, I think of like ugly tears, mascara running down the face. But that's not what emotional means.
No.
And so kind of also starting to help people try to reframe that emotional doesn't just mean bad emotions.
That's a really good point.
Like, stop being so nobody ever tells you when you're super happy, like, stop being so emotional.
No, in fact, that most of the time, that's like ourselves being like, okay, I'm way too excited about this.
But you don't ever say I'm being too emotional.
No.
That's only when we feel bad.
But
that's not what emotional means.
Yeah.
Okay. Emotional means feeling one's emotions.
You know what that makes me think of? Like, it makes me think of like leading with your heart.
Oh.
And I learned about that concept. I learned about that concept while I was doing a pole dancing class.
Of course. Where else would you learn it?
As you do. Well, apparently you learn it when you learn how to skydive. Because the lesson is you have to like lead with your heart, like chest out, or else you die.
Okay.
And so
you will do death.
Yeah. And so like as we were doing spins and stuff in class, the concept of like lead with your heart or else you die, like that's just so connected to everything else.
Heart openers, right?
Heart openers. But like this is kind of the opposite of what we were going to talk about. But like being drawn towards like your passion and stuff like that, like in one sense, there's always like that gut check.
Yeah.
But also, I'll bring it back around. Also, even if your heart is saying one thing, just because that idea of like leading with your heart is like maybe taking you in a different direction, or your heart's like calling you to like a family member at that point in time and stuff like that, there are other things that are going to cause you to kind of like have to bend and shift and do
it's
all
not
of
all
that.
one way?
Shocker.
Oh my gosh.
So today, I guess what we're really talking about is managing the idea of
pragmatism.
Yeah. Like
leading with your head.
Because even in skydiving, like even if you lead with your heart and have your hands open and are like doing that lovely free fall, if your brain doesn't tell you to pull the goddamn ripcord, like you're gonna die.
Hard or not.
Exactly.
I don't know why I'm laughing. That's so inappropriate.
Skydiving. Who knew? Who knew that's where today would go?
Laughing about death.
Oh, I did that with someone else last night too.
Like you do.
We were talking about a designer that died in investment pieces and shit got bleak really fast.
Oh my goodness. Well, I don't want this to be a bleak discussion because, okay, I think sometimes there's this idea of like making the sexy choices, right? Leading with your heart, doing what you love, fueling your passion, blah, blah, blah.
Well, and I would say those are also like the very scary choices, like which has been turned into this idea of sexy.
Yeah.
Like there's so many people out there that are like, I did the thing that no one said I should do and look at how amazing this is and things like that. And really I've been kind of walking through that story recently. Because fun fact, recording day is the year anniversary of when I made a really bold choice.
Happy bold choice day.
Thank you. And like I do have that kind of story, but also like if you follow it up, there's a lot of pragmatic choices that came after. So I think yes, it can be one way. Of course, I feel like we say this every episode. Yes, it can be one way. But also, what about the times when you don't have that option? Because my bold choice,
or when it's not the good option,
right?
The most effective option.
Yeah, like my bold choice last year, I was able to do that because of a lot of other padding, like a lot of other external items where I didn't have to be pragmatic. I could be scared and sexy.
Yeah, right? Like I'm good. Because, there's a net down there.
Mhm.
You're not doing trapeze without a net.
Exactly.
I also
or jumping out of an airplane without a parachute. Let's keep that one going. I like it.
Oh, okay. Because I was going to talk about something else. So,
No. But like in terms of God, I lost the word. Not adjectives, guys. Anyways, examples. No, like, so you're not doing trapeze without a net, but you're also not jumping out of a plane without
a parachute.
Exactly. That's all I meant. Continue.
So I was thinking about this story that my dad told me. Or not even really a story. So you've met my dad.
Mm-hmm.
So fun fact, we used to watch football together all the
Okay.
time. And knowing my dad, that doesn't sound surprising, yeah?
Mm-mm.
So he used to tell me, like, everybody wants to be the quarterback.
Mm-hmm.
Because that's the sexy position.
Yeah.
Not his words, but that's what he meant.
Mm-hmm.
He
I
said,
could totally see your dad being like, that's the sexy position. Twinkle in his eye.
I know.
Okay,
But what he
continue.
said was, and this was a great life lesson at the time. I forget what we were talking about, but I do remember the lesson. So obviously, good lesson.
Oh, this stuck with you, apparently.
Yeah. So he says, but what they forget about is all the linemen.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have those, it doesn't matter how good your quarterback is because he's going to be dead.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, you, Tammy, are a lineman. You're super practical. And you have to be there to make everything else work.
Mm-hmm.
But you never get the recognition
Mm-hmm.
because it's not the sexy position.
Mm-hmm.
For all of our listeners, I'm sure, who avidly watch football,
that makes perfect sense.
It makes perfect sense. But
it is so disconnected from my worldview that I can't even come up with like a different way to phrase it.
Well, there isn't really.
But I understand. I quote unquote understand.
But the thing is, right? Like, you need those times.
Mm-hmm.
You need those instances where you're doing practical things to make the sexy stuff work the way you want it to.
Well, and that kind of ties into what we talked about last week when we talked about this idea of showing up and getting the job done even when it's the last thing in the world that you want to do.
Right.
On any level.
Right. So I think it's a good continuation from our discussion with take your pick of examples that we've used because, oh my goodness, they just run the spectrum of things. So I think it's important to talk about because there are times for that. There are times, like, I am a psychologist. I'm a firm believer in therapy. And I'm also a firm believer that there's a time and a place. Because when you really think about therapy and what therapy is and what it's for and what it does, it's all about change. And we know change is difficult. And so you have to have the mental resources, the mental capacity to be able to do that work. And so sometimes it's not the right time, yet you still have to take care of yourself in those moments. Your emotional health, your mental health, because it's connected to your physical health. We all know this, right? Mind-body connection. I'm not saying anything new. So you have to know how to do this well because you're just going to be needed in these times. So it could mean doing a lot of work around keeping your emotions or the negative emotions that you're experiencing at a low enough level that you can tolerate them. And then when you're in a better space to maybe process trauma that you've experienced, then you go to therapy to do that. Life coach, whoever. But taking care of yourself in that time when you can't go do that.
Yeah.
Doing the practical things at work, right? You had a great example of, like, maybe not following your passion, but being really realistic when you, in times of need, where that cash flow is going to come from. And it doesn't mean your whole business has to be centered on that, but there do have to be those more practical pieces. So,
yeah, I think I saw an example of something that really, it was a head scratcher, and we don't do this podcast to drag anyone down, and I have a feeling like the example that I'm going to use, some folks may know this person.
Oh, okay.
So it's just my thought process when I see things online. That's my asterisk going into this.
Okay.
This person has spent years building a really, really great community, and has, used that in a really positive way, both kind of socially in terms of giving support to people, as well as monetarily and using it as a marketing platform.
Okay.
It makes sense.
Okay.
And then this person started to choose different kind of income streams. Cool, you do you. Some of them I generally don't agree with because they're MLM, and we all know how I feel about that. But really leaned heavy into it. And then shared, well, I'm done with this group because my heart's not in it anymore. I'm taking applications for someone else to lead it. And I had many thoughts about that.
Like
And
what?
many feelings.
What were they?
Thoughts
Thoughts or feelings or whatever you want to share.
Yeah, so it was shock over, wait, you're writing off such a good flow of like leads, because at the end of the day, if you are an entrepreneur, a business owner, your group, your Facebook group, your Instagram pod, your LinkedIn group, any of that, that's your lead base. We talk about building email lists. I'm such a strong proponent of having a strong email list, but also the groups are often the first stop into the email list anyway. You're signing off on all of those. Okay, interesting. Also, you're handing it over even when people have trusted you as kind of like the guide for all of this, right? And I didn't necessarily agree with that because some people show up for very specific things. And of course, like, groups are going to see a change. Like, when things like this happen, people leave and stuff, which is cool. But it's also like you're walking away from a lot of people that were kind of like trusting you without giving them sort of like
a really good exit strategy.
Yeah, like there's no. Exactly. That's what I'm getting at. There was no exit strategy. There was no aftercare plan. Like there's nothing like that. It's, hey, I'm done with this and I'm taking applications for someone else. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I just felt like there was a lack of professional responsibility that was there and a lack of care towards an audience that
was really meaningful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's my side tangent.
I mean, I think it's a good point, right? Even if you've decided that your heart's not in something anymore, just dropping it and walking away, is that doing more harm than good to the people you've committed to on some level, right?
Yeah.
Because even we commit to people on a personal level, but as a business, particularly an entrepreneurial business where you are your brand, you're making this commitment to others, right? And so it doesn't even make good business sense to destroy that, leads or not, because goodwill and relationships make businesses run.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, it's not all money, which I used to think it was, but it's not, because people don't want to feel like transactions. And so maybe walking away from that, like this person did, made those people in that group who found it really meaningful and helpful and community and great, made them feel like transactions.
Yeah, like it could be argued, well, this person is giving their time and energy and stuff into developing this community. Cool. If you've invested that much time into developing it, yes, in theory, it's your prerogative to just be like, I'm done. But also, like, respect your business baby more.
Well, like even Finn found her, right? They talked about exit strategy and like the life cycle of a business, and that ending doesn't have to be negative. Like, you can pass on your business and exit, and that's kind of expected. I think that there's more effective ways to do it. I think there's less effective ways to do it. I think just this example feels like a less effective way without knowing all the super details, because I'm pretty sure I know who you're talking about, but I'm not sure. So we'll talk about it off air, and like then I'll have more of an idea. But just hearing what I've heard, I'm like, I don't know, like you developed this community over a number of years, and so like why do you not have more care for the thing you put so much energy into?
Well, and I think also thinking about the type of business or stream of income or like aspect of your business, because I will say like this is just one piece,
Oh,
right?
of course.
Like thinking of that specific stream, like to your point, there are more effective ways, there are less effective ways. This felt very out of the blue.
Yeah.
In terms of, well, I'm washing my hands of this versus like, and it like along with the I'm looking for new people, it was the I felt this way for 6 months.
Oh.
But let's play that out. If you've been thinking about changing stuff and if you're ready for, a twist in your business and things like that, I mean, I don't have all the answers, but I think maybe a different way to go about it is sit with it for a little bit, couple weeks, maybe a month, do whatever inner work as like a leader. And then that's where advisors come in. That's where people close to you come into play, where you bounce ideas off of it. But let's use the 6-month timeline that we're talking about right now. And by month 3 or so, after thinking about it, talking with people, ask your customer what they want. Maybe a lot of them would just be like, you know what, let me go find my own thing. Let me go do, like, maybe there's a waste of energy in finding,
This second person?
yeah, another person, because people are just gonna, like, I think it's pretty safe to say people were in that group for that person.
Yeah.
So, and maybe this is too specific of an example,
Well,
but
no, because I was in a Facebook group that was the person who ran it wanted to step away, and there was a lot of notice like, hey, I'm considering this, I haven't really decided what to do yet, I wanted to let you know, I'm assessing how many people in here are still active members, I'll let you know as this goes, but this is kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah.
And then that kind of went, and then there was another message like, I've really decided to do this. This is how I'm going to do it. And I wanted to let you all know. So kind of keeping us in the loop, right? And not just being like, well, suddenly nobody's posting in here anymore. And like, what the hell's going on, right?
Yeah.
Like, people don't like to
like
be left.
our group was.
Right. People don't like to be left in the dark. I think, especially in business, when a customer feels left in the dark, they feel taken advantage of, they feel cheated, they're left with an icky feeling, and you've now destroyed your goodwill with those people.
Yeah, the best possible outcome at that point is like minimally is a lack of trust.
Yeah.
And that's, in my world, that's one of the worst things that could possibly happen, because when you lose trust,
that's the worst thing in anyone's world. Like,
what else could happen?
Not even in business.
Yeah.
Like, yours and my relationship is built on trust.
Yeah.
If we do things that erode the foundation, our friendship is gone. It just, because everything's built on that.
Yeah.
Businesses, relationships, romantic relationships, friendships, family relationships, they're all built on this idea of trust and knowing like what is coming, right?
Well, and even like with the business example, if you erode trust in one facet, then that undermines the rest. Like, I think of it kind of like a riptide almost.
Oh,
where it's spinning around and then you get caught and it just kind of sucks everything else in.
Yeah.
So that's the other thing where, yes, we talk about boundaries and things like that and having items kind of sectioned off. We also talk a lot about integration, so it all depends. But with this, with your business and with you as a professional, I don't care if you're an entrepreneur, if you're working corporate, if you're like, I don't care what that is.
Yeah.
In your professional life, if you lose trust in one area, it's going to erode trust from other facets.
I think that just, right? So even though this wasn't the original conversation we were going to have about pragmatism,
It never is.
It sounded like a very emotional decision, and there were pragmatic pieces.
I like bringing it back. Yes.
You're welcome. I'm talented.
You are.
I went to school for a long time to learn how to do that. So it sounded like a pretty emotional decision with these very pragmatic pieces that weren't attended to as effectively as they could have been.
Yeah.
And without knowing all the details, I always take the position of people are doing the best they can, and sometimes that means they need to do better. And so that may be the case here, but without knowing everything, I bet if we knew everything, we'd have a better understanding and we'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. But that's the point, right? If we had more information, if the customer had more information, if they really knew what was going on or how to communicate that in an appropriate way, then you don't erode that trust.
Yeah.
People may be disappointed and still trust you, still be willing to jump back in with you in a new venture, in a new project, in a new, right? Or to come back to you at another time, maybe 6 months to a year later and be like, hey, let's consider this person again. So I think it just speaks to this needing to attend to very practical pieces.
Well, and it ties back to an episode we did a couple weeks ago with learning from, I think we kind of focused on learning from your mistakes, but really that whole episode was about learning from your experiences versus mistakes, because I think there's a difference.
Sure.
And, being, I don't want to say beholden to yourself, but holding yourself accountable to do the work after a decision, like a business decision is made, and when you do see the outcome, essentially doing like a teardown of things.
Yeah, debriefing.
Yeah. Yeah. In corporate speak, a teardown is like good, bad, all the things, not just tearing it down. But taking that time to really say, this was good because I think I would do this different because.
Well, that just brings to mind like this idea that hindsight's 2020, right? We don't know going forward really what's going to happen, and we can't control for everything. And so we make the best decision we can, and then we learn from it.
Yeah.
Right? So that's kind of what you're talking about, because hindsight is 2020. You can look back and say like, oh, well, here's what would have been more effective had I known XYZ, or had I known this outcome was going to happen, I would have done this differently. And so that's the way. And then I think we talked about in that episode, or maybe another one, but that's how you learn. Right. So I was listening to one of our episodes. I can't remember which one.
A good one.
Yeah. About how when somebody has just had one strategy that's always worked for them, they're not nimble or agile or able enough to shift away from that. So having a certain amount of adversity or things that didn't quite go the way you wanted them to helps you to learn and make corrections and be able to make adjustments and be more effective in the future. If you never have that experience, you never learn. You just keep doing it the same way you've always done it.
Well, even to that point, there's also this attitude that's become quite prevalent among many entrepreneurs and business leaders of, I don't care what you say. I don't care what the feedback is. I'm doing it this way. I'm leading with my heart and I'm trusting my gut, and this is what's happening. Screw all y'all.
Yeah.
And
that's unfortunate, isn't it? I mean, I think sometimes we talked about that too. Like we get stuck, right? Like we feel like we just have to hold on to it. And if we don't hold on to it all the way, we've kind of lost it completely.
Yeah.
When really it's not really all or nothing like that. And when we do let go a little bit, which is super scary.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying it's not.
Mm-hmm.
So like when we do let go and we take that step and we trust, we can have a chance at a better outcome, and probably one we've been wishing for or wanting more.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so hard when control is so important, because control makes us feel like we're certain.
Mm-hmm.
So we hold on to things that we think if we 100% control it, but it's kind of a myth, right? Because we aren't 100% in control of anything. And so I think the very first time you ever try that, the very first time, it's so scary, and you need some way to like metaphorically kind of have someone there next to you. So either you hear it in your head or you feel it in your heart, or like you have a good talk and you take that first step and it's super scary. And then you're like, oh, this maybe wasn't so bad. So I think but getting through that first step is really difficult and challenging. And so that's why it makes it so hard for people not to change sometime, because the idea of letting go for even a minute, the idea of even stepping off that path seems so scary, because there's this idea of, well, what if it doesn't work? And there is always that possibility, but we ignore, like, what if it does work? We ignore that. We don't hear that in our head.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can't tell you how many times I've said to a client, they're like, well, what if this happens? I'm like, well, what if it doesn't? What if this other good, positive thing happens? And so many times I hear, well, I hadn't considered that.
Yeah. Oh my God, I've been holding myself to that recently with working on the book.
Mm-hmm.
Spoiler, working on a book. Where, like, for the last couple weeks, it's been really hard for me to write because of the nerves around well, what if people think it's ridiculous, and who am I to be doing this, and all of these things.
All the anxiety.
Right? And then in the past couple days, I've been challenging with, well, sure, what if that happens? Like, what if people don't like it? What happens if people do? You know?
Or even, what if they don't like it? What's going to happen? Mm-hmm. And really examining the catastrophizing that's going on in your head.
Exactly. If nobody likes it,
they're gonna love it. Let's be honest.
Yeah. If people don't like it, which, I mean, how could that happen?
Right.
But if it did, what is the worst? I can ignore notifications on the internet. Like, I don't have to. You don't have to read the comments.
It's true.
If that is a takeaway, if that is the only thing you get out of this episode, you don't have to read the comments on the internet.
That's right.
And I will have written a book with a group of amazing women, and it will be out in the universe.
Yeah.
That's it.
I mean, yeah. There's so many possibilities, right? And we can't even think of them all, because the possibilities that I'm thinking of are probably different than the ones you're thinking of, because it's informed by our experience. And so, like, yeah, that could happen. So what if it did? What would that mean for you?
Exactly.
Like, what would it mean for you? So I don't expect you to answer that. But so really examining, because sometimes you're like, oh yeah, okay, so if that happened, I would feel embarrassed. Okay, so what if you did feel embarrassed? How would you manage that? What would you do?
Yeah.
And kind of walking through the steps of that catastrophe, kind of one by one, little by little, and maybe realizing that what you think is a huge catastrophe maybe isn't.
Yeah.
And like, even if, let's say, the book wasn't successful right away, well, think about how many movies didn't find their audience till they weren't in the theaters anymore. I was just thinking of some that I liked. And so it's kind of a silly example, but it could pick up steam at another time. So there's all these other possibilities that we don't think of. We're just like, I don't want that to happen. So everything I do is going to be in an effort to not have that happen. But then what are you going to do instead?
Yeah.
Right? You don't want to work from a place of not, because you're really not in control of it.
Yeah.
And so kind of brings me back to this idea of people letting go and listening to other people, and maybe letting other voices in to say, like, what if you consider this? What if you consider that? And realizing that you really don't have the control you think you have, and there may be some positivity or worth, I can't think of the word I'm trying to use right now, in what other people are saying. And it doesn't mean you have to swallow it whole.
Yeah.
Right? But take a piece here, take a piece there. I hadn't even considered it.
Which
right?
really, in my humble opinion, is the best way to do it, because you don't want to take anything blindly.
Right.
You know, like, listen to people that you respect and, like, digest it and turn it into something that works for you.
Or you may even explore it and be like, okay, and I'm still going to do it this way. Okay, but then at least you've explored it, you've considered it, you've thought about it.
Yeah.
You've had a little bit more flexible thinking, and you're deciding to stay on this course.
Yeah. It's like if you're going to a grand ball and somebody's like, here, wear this dress. And you're like, oh, I really, okay, sure. But then you put it on and like deep down, you're like, oh, that's not great.
Yeah.
But then if you add like your own like vintage necklace and do your hair differently, then suddenly you've styled it for you instead of just like going like a catalog model.
Or maybe you put it on and it was amazing and it was something you never thought you would like, but on you it looks like sparkly and magical. So I think there's a lot of possibilities there. Oh, whoops.
So
I don't know that was the conversation.
That was not the episode we had planned.
But I think the takeaway is there's times for these more practical pieces. And considering the practical pieces, even if you're going down a lead with your heart road, will help you lead with your heart more effectively.
Well, I mean, remember, if you lead with your heart, don't forget to pull like the drawstring.
Right.
Like that's
don't die.
Yeah. You still need a parachute.
Yeah. So how are you gonna plan for that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. We'll talk to all y'all next week.
Bye, friends.
Bye.